Lesage Middaugh,
And
a.k.a. Fleur.
where does the Lesage come from? Is that your middle name?
That is my maiden name.
What's your middle name?
I don't use my middle name,
Why
ever.
don't you tell me what it is anyway?
It's June, but I don't ever use it
Did you not ever
on
like
any.
it?
I never liked it, never was interested in having it around.
Okay. Why don't you tell me your birth date and tell me where you were born?
Oh my, do I have to tell my birthday? Well, I guess. I really should be proud. I was born February 2nd, 1934 in Chicago, Illinois at Ravenswood Hospital.
And who are your parents?
My parents were Adelaide Heyer Bramstead Lesage and Irvin Lesage.
And so you were born in Amherst,
I was born in Chicago,
in Chicago, but then you moved to Amherst.
Elmhurst. We moved to Elmhurst when I was about 3 or 4. It was right after the Depression.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about Elmhurst?
We moved to Elmhurst because it was some property that my grandfather had given to my mother, and Elmhurst at that time was a very small town, very wonderful place to raise children, where children walked to school, rode sleds down the street, things of that sort. It was a simple life.
Did you walk to school?
I walked to school every day of my grade school days, and I rode on a sled in the wintertime in the snow down the hill in front of my house.
What kind of house did you live in?
It started out to be a simpler house that it has wound up to be. It was, let's see, it had one bedroom downstairs, 2 bedrooms downstairs, and then my parents enlarged it and made rooms for us upstairs as the family grew.
Where did the house come from?
From my grandfather. He left it to my mother.
But so had he bought it from somebody else?
I'm not sure how he acquired it. I don't really remember how he acquired it. He had some money prior to the Depression, and possibly that's where it came from.
And what kind of so what high school did you go to?
Went to York Community High School and rode the bus back and forth to York Community High School.
What kind of student were you?
I was an excellent student. My father wouldn't allow me to be anything else.
Did you have any academic awards?
I don't really remember back that far, but I remember it as being a very successful academic life, and I enjoyed it, liked it, and that's why it was.
And where did you go to college?
Went first a year to DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana, and then transferred to Purdue, where I graduated in 1955.
And when did you move to California?
I moved to California to be with Dick, my present husband, my present husband of 45 years. And we came out here in 1957 after he was in the Army.
When did you get married?
1957, June 29th.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you and Richard met?
We met when I was typing in a classroom at Purdue, and he was working on his master's thesis. And that was the day we met. And our first date was at the races in Indianapolis.
What level in school were you at that point?
I was probably a junior.
And what did you think of him when you first met him?
Oh, I thought he was very friendly, very interested in women, liked girls.
So he was a playboy.
He was, yes, he was. He liked girls, always has.
And so what happened after you met him?
We went on the date and became very involved, but at the time I was very active with the theater group at Purdue, and I think, as I recall, I had to make a decision which I was going to choose, the theater group or Richard, and I believe I chose Richard because the theater group didn't seem to promise too much in the way of a future at that time.
But you thought Richard, did you know right away that Richard you saw a future in him?
I recall having come home and told Mother that this was the man I was going to marry. I don't think she believed me, but I remember having told her that.
Okay, tell me a little bit about your parents. You grew up in Elmhurst.
One of my earliest memories is actually the death of my grandfather, Henry, and he is the one that I've been doing most of the research on. But I remember his deathbed. I remember a deathbed scene, And that may not be very pleasant to talk about, but I do remember that as an early recollection. And I remember the house as being it was just a very, very nice environment for any children to grow up in. I'm sure Bob would agree with me. It really was very
Who's
pleasant, and
Bob?
Bob is my brother, my only sibling,
What's the age difference between you and Bob?
5 years.
Is he older or younger?
I regret to say he's the younger, if I'm going to have to be truthful.
So tell me a little bit about Irv. What was he like when you were a kid?
Well, Irv was a product of the Depression. He came from a very um, limited family life. His brother had died of diphtheria. The Depression hit hard, and the family was not close. And the family came from Green Bay, Wisconsin, but they did not help each other. And there was a lot of bitterness in the family as a result of the various members not helping each other. And to this day, as I try to do some of the research, I keep getting that feeling over and over again that there was a lot of bitterness among the family members because they didn't help when money was so tight. And then they moved to
Be more specific. What do you think caused the bitterness?
the fact that the family members did not help each other when they had no money and no
Name
food.
names.
No, my only other name is Donald Smith, my cousin, my only relative, Donald Smith. And he tends to have some of that bitterness toward the relatives in Green Bay. Of course, I have the lineup of all of the various other people. I did know my father's sister, who had a mental illness, and she,
So you're saying mental illness runs in our family?
God, I hope not. But she did have some kind of a problem because I can remember being, as a small child, being in a cabin that we had rented up in the mountains. And I remember that for absolutely no reason whatsoever, she took hot popcorn and threw it at me. And it's just that kind of a thing that would impress a child. And so I remember that. And she subsequently died in an automobile accident. She was in the passenger seat of a car driven by her husband and was killed.
What was her name?
Elizabeth
Elizabeth what?
Smith was her maiden name, and then her Elizabeth Smith was her married name, and Elizabeth Lesage would be her maiden name. Would have been her maiden name.
So tell me more about Irv.
Well, as I say, Irv was a product of the Depression and had a great deal of the bitterness that came as a result of that. But when he moved to the suburbs and had a family, he was very, very proud of his family and devoted, an absolutely devoted father, and really enjoyed the family and was proud of everybody, was proud of Bob, was proud of me, everything that we did. Just a very, very devoted father.
Was he an educated man?
No, he never went past the 8th grade.
And what did he do for a living?
He worked in the post office, and he was a supervisor in the post office.
Do you think he enjoyed his work?
He did not enjoy his work, and he did it just for the security of a job that was civil service and that was secure, so that he could support his family.
And that, do you think, came out of the Depression? Or?
Yes, no question. The Depression marked everyone. Everyone who was of that era was very much marked by the Depression.
Did the Depression have any influence on you?
Only that I bore the fruits of it. In other words, people wanted their children to have more than they had had. And that I reaped the reward of. In other words, they wanted us to have a college education. They wanted us to have a good childhood because they had not had one.
How did you feel about the environment you grew up in? Was it an environment of plenty, or did you feel like you wanted
Oh,
more?
very much plenty. Mother and her mother's mother lived with us for quite a while, and they cooked a great deal, and it was definitely an environment of plenty, yes.
Tell me about Adelaide.
Adelaide was an only child. She was very bitter about the divorce of her parents and being shunted back and forth from California to Chicago. Her father, Henry, owned a drugstore in Chicago, and she would go back and forth. And she was very bitter about that kind of life. But she was a very well-educated woman and was a graduate of the University of Chicago. So she had a good education and was a wonderful, wonderful mother in person.
Was she an educated person?
She graduated from the University of Chicago in French, I believe, was her major. I think French was her major.
And how do you think she felt about education in general?
Oh, deeply believed in it. Both of them deeply believed in education, the importance of an education, and how important it was to go to college.
How did an educated woman like Adelaide wind up with someone like her?
That's an interesting question. It was because she needed security, I believe, and he loved her deeply, and it was at a time when that you could see how it would come about because they did love each other, and the depression and the lack of money and establishing a family. She was not young when let's see, I was born in 1934. Um, I don't know, but she was not terribly young
More towards you.
when I was born.
Hold it more toward like this. Okay, there you go. Point it more toward your mouth.
Okay.
There you go.
Or you just run it out. I'll give you a roll.
And okay, so Adelaide, did she work?
She worked at International Harvester so that we could go to college. She was a secretary at International Harvester after we grew up, and she worked there for many years.
What'd she do?
She was secretary, steno pool. She started out in the steno pool and became a secretary. Had many friends there who she kept in contact with for quite some time.
So do you think she enjoyed it?
I think she did, yes. And she enjoyed keeping up the relations after she left. But again, it's hard, as we all know, it's hard going to work every day and raising a family and all of the other things that happened. But yes, she did.
Tell me about your first working experiences.
Well,
Your very first job.
my very first job, I went to Chicago Title and Trust Company when I was 15, lied about my age, and told them I was 16 and was canned 2 weeks later
Why were you canned?
because they found out about my age and you weren't allowed to work until you were 16.
What did you do with the money from that job?
Well, all through the summers that I worked, I was only allowed to make, as I recall, $400 for the summer, because if I made, it was either 400 or 500. If I made over that amount, then my father was no longer able to take me as a tax deduction, and so it wouldn't have been worth my working. So I could only work every summer up to that $400 and then never go over that every summer. And I worked in the Loop in Chicago.
So what did you do with the money that you made at that job?
Probably bought clothes with it.
What kind of clothes would you buy?
Cashmere sweaters and saddle shoes.
What years were that?
Oh, that would have been,
50s?
oh, no. Prior to that, it was when I was going to college. No, you're right. I'm sorry, you are right. It would have been late 40s, early 50s, yes. Yes.
Crazy. And then, okay, so do you remember the war at all? The Second World War?
I remember everybody sitting around the kitchen table listening to Roosevelt. Definitely. I remember that very, very well. And how strongly opinionated everyone was about Roosevelt, how deeply he affected our lives.
And do you feel like the war had an impact on your life?
Oh, absolutely. It had an impact on everyone's lives. I remember taking butter. In those days, you took oleomargarine, and there was a little color button in it. And you would squeeze that button, and then you would knead the oleomargarine until it became yellow. And that was what we had for butter. And I can still remember doing that.
Wow.
And then I remember a cousin who came to live with us after the war in 1945. His name was Frank Bastian, and he lived with us for a couple of years.
Why?
At loose ends after the war, didn't know what to do with himself, unmarried, no children, just a GI that had just gotten out of the war, cousin.
And then you moved to California, and what kind of car did you drive?
Oh, we had a Chevy convertible, blue. A blue Chevy convertible. It was our first car. And we had it shipped. We bought it in the East and had it shipped out here. Somebody drove it out here for us.
Really? Who drove it?
A hired person. We hired a person to drive it out here. And I flew.
Let's see. And when did you decide you wanted to have kids?
From the beginning. But we didn't have them for quite a while.
How long were you married before you had kids?
we were married 7 years before we had Alex, and another 5 years before we had you.
So how old were you when you had Alex?
Let's see, I was 30 when I had Alex.
Okay. And how old were you when you had me?
36, 35, 36, somewhere in there.
And was it unusual to be? Were you an older mom, or
I think at that point the trend was growing toward later having children later. The trend was beginning at that time. Not everyone did, but the trend was beginning.
And okay, well, I think we're gonna have to wrap up right now. But I have many more questions for you, and we will have to continue them on another tape.
All right, thank you very much.
Is the little red line on?
I can't tell from here.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
What's your name?
Dick Middaugh,
Is that your full name? Why don't you tell me your
Richard
full name?
W. Middaugh,
What's the W for?
Whiting, middle name,
And,
named after my uncle, Richard Van Every Whiting.
Okay. Tell me your birth date and where you were born.
September 22nd, 1929, at the Swedish Hospital in Seattle.
And who were your parents?
Helen Middaugh and Theodore Middaugh, otherwise known as Ted.
Okay, and so you were born in Seattle. Where were you raised?
I was raised, well, we lived in a suburb of Seattle called Edmonds, which was right on the water. My parents owned a home that my grandfather had in effect given them, kind of like Fleur's family, and given them the land.
My family.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, world changes.
Some people are luckier than others.
Anyway, it was now it's become a very fashionable suburb, but in those days it was only 17 miles out of Seattle, and it had little chicken farms, you know, egg ranches and little cattle farms we used to get during the Depression. Actually, there was a lot of barter, and I can remember milk bottles on the doorstep and eggs and things that the local people would give us, and my dad owned a garage, and he would repair cars and all of that. So that was the way it was during the Depression. By the way, I'd like to make a little correction on Fleur's commentary, and that was, Fleur implied that her father was marked by the Depression. Her father, it was before that. Her father was really marked by the terrible poverty that existed all over the United States prior to World War I. And during World War I, he, I think, worked for the Red Cross or something of that nature, moved to Chicago from Green Bay. Green Bay was a, dead end. And moved to Chicago. And then after World War I, he was very fortunate. He got a job in the post office department. And I think that was through Glenn and all of that. But that's another story. I'll let Fleur tell that at another time. And he rode through the Depression with a job, and that's something, 1929 and through the 30s, and that's something most people, I mean, enormous numbers of people, remember we had 25% unemployment. He had a job, and that was terribly, terribly important. It became a supervisor ultimately and so forth. But he was marked. I mean, Fleur is absolutely correct, marked by the poverty that existed when he was a youth and a child. And his brother died of diphtheria, and he can remember the screaming of the child and all. I mean, terrible things, just terribly marked. I just wanted to make a little correction there. And if Fleur has any addenda, she can make that.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about Ted.
Ted was born. Well, Ted was adopted.
First of all, who was Ted?
Ted was my father, Theodore Adelbert Middaugh.
And
He was adopted, and he was born, if not in Portland, somewhere near Portland, we think. We really don't know. That's the problem. And my father, Ted, tried to find his lineage and could not. At that time, all of the files were closed, and it was very difficult.
And tell me about what specific things he did to try to find his father.
Well, I can remember a trip to a suburb of Oregon where he had heard that an individual actually knew his lineage But the problem was the guy wouldn't. I can remember I was with Ted at the time. This would have been, in the late 40s somewhere. And I went with him, and I can remember the fact that the man wouldn't tell Ted, absolutely refused to tell Ted his real birth parents. I'll never know. It's too far back. I just can't tell you the circumstances, and I was too young at the time to really delve into it. But it would be very interesting to find out. Anyway, he was then adopted by an exceedingly wealthy family in Seattle, Horace Middaugh, and his wife's name was Elizabeth, yes, Elizabeth Kumler. And Fleur did some research on the internet not long ago. She got the 1900 census, and it indicated that Elizabeth Kumler and Horace Middaugh lived in the same boarding house in Seattle, and undoubtedly that's where they met. I mean, it's quite interesting. We didn't know that. One of those little asides. Anyway, Theodore was a very interesting man. He had been a lock tender in Pennsylvania in the 1870s, probably. Fought in the Civil War. Young man, very young.
Where?
Pardon me?
A lock tender where?
In Pennsylvania, and it's very interesting. There are a whole bunch of Middaughs in Pennsylvania, and when I was doing some work for Lytton in one of the divisions, they said, "Oh yeah, we know all about the Middaughs. They're all over the place around here," which is very interesting. Well, anyway, he moved to Seattle in 1888, and he was a self-taught engineer, and he went to shortly after was well, obviously 10 years after was the big gold strike in Alaska. And he went up there as kind of a consulting engineer and foreman and superintendent on the White Pass and Yukon Railway, the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Railway. And Fleur and I, last summer, went on that railway. It goes up out of Skagway, and it's one of the engineering marvels because it just slides up this long canyon. Very interesting, very interesting. Well, anyway, he did that. That would have been 1898, 1899, somewhere in there. And then came back to Seattle and gained such a reputation that he borrowed money, and he had invented a sluicing mechanism for obtaining gravel at a very low rate of cost. And the bank loaned him money, and he built in Stillicum, which is just south of Tacoma. He built a big ocean dock and bought the land behind it because he had done some prospecting and found that was a great source of gravel. And Seattle was just starting to come on, just starting to boom. And he built the ocean dock, and no sooner the first tug came in, and the captain miscalculated and smashed into the dock and knocked the whole thing down. And Horace went back to the bank, and by that time he had such a reputation. They said, "Horace, don't worry about it. We'll give you the money again, just on your name." And they rebuilt the dock. And you can today see the big big gravel pits behind Stillicum. I mean, at Stillicum, south of Tacoma, if you're in the Narrows and that part of Puget Sound. Here are the big gravel pits, and then he built ones on Vashon Island that you could see from Tacoma. I mean, it's just amazing. He became very wealthy, and then he became interested. He became the president of I think it was the German American Bank, Hamburg American Bank. Anyway, one of the banks in Seattle, and there was a bank panic of 1919, and the bank failed. And he was the only shareholder to make good. But he had started Pioneer Sand and Gravel, which is still operating today. It's the largest sand and gravel company in Seattle. He and Henry Kaiser paved the streets of Seattle, as a matter of fact, when he was, in that period before 1919. Anyway, long story short, he lost all his money. Had to sell Pioneer to make good to the bank, and lived modestly. He had some money, but he lived modestly thereafter. And then when Ted came along and Horace died, Horace had remarried, and the new wife took off with all the rest of the money, so Ted got nothing, and that's a true story. And we even visited. I can remember him visiting this lady. She, by that time, was in a Civil War veterans home. Are we okay? Are we recording okay? And she, of course, denied that she had gotten any money from Horace. And I mean, it's just a fascinating story. But anyway, that's that side of the family. Helen, on the other hand, there's a very interesting story there because she was born in Chicago. We saw her in the 1900 census too, and her brother, Bud, Richard, had not been born at that time, 1900. Helen was born in 1898. Ted was born in 1898.
What was Bud's full name?
Richard Whiting Middaugh, and I'm sorry, Richard Van Every Whiting, and I'm Richard Whiting Middaugh. So there you are. You know, that's the continuation of that process. Anyway, very interesting because they moved. The father turned out to be an alcoholic and died, Helen's father. And Marion, Marion, a male spelling, the mother, her father and mother had moved to Seattle. And so in 1907, they took the Canadian Pacific to Seattle, checked it out, went back, and then about 1909, I believe it was, they moved to Seattle. And they all lived in a little house on Blaine Street, which is still there. I can't remember the address, but we've checked it out. Ted, on the other hand, lived in this great mansion at number 10 Comstock Street in Seattle, both on Queen Anne Hill. They both went to school on in Queen Anne schools, and that's where they met. They became childhood sweethearts. And neither finished high school. Both went to Queen Anne High. And they, as I say, did not finish high school. Ted he was actually in the National Guard, and in 1917 went overseas and fought in the First World War, was in the Signal Corps, and drove for a colonel for a time, an old friend of his of his dad's, and, you know, kind of all very, very interesting. Anyway, saw a lot of action and so forth. And then they were married in 1919, and as their wedding present, my grandfather still had an interest in a big salmon cannery on one of the islands between Sitka and Juneau, an island with no other people on it whatsoever, and where the cannery was, except a half-breed who was a watchman for the cannery. Well, they had spent a half-breed was an Indian and a white, and that's what they called them, half-breeds. If you haven't seen enough westerns, Western movies aren't part of your history. And they lived in they went up as caretakers also for the cannery for a winter. That was their honeymoon, winter of 1919, 1920, somewhere in there. And they had, the only people who visited were a mailboat that would come in every 2 weeks, and they'd have a big party, and they had a huge commissary for the cannery. So they had all the goods that they wanted, and they'd have these big parties, and when the mailboat came in, the crew and all of that, and Ted shot deer for meat, and it was quite exciting. And anyway, that was a very interesting period in their life. And then he went to work after they got back. He went to work for Union Oil, same company that I worked for, 30 years later, 40 years later, whatever it was, and drove a truck for them, and then became I think he was manager of one of their distribution centers and so forth. Anyway, that's and then Helen's family, as I say, her father was an alcoholic. They moved to Seattle, and he committed suicide ultimately. I think Helen's father committed suicide. That was Helen Thayer Whiting was her name, before she was married, and then Helen Whiting Middaugh after she was married. Well, anyway, her family were kind of civil servants. So the grandfather was a civil servant of some kind in Seattle, and they lived a modest middle-class existence. and were, you know, fairly well read, and no one had college educations in those days. So that's the background on Richard Whiting Middaugh.
Way to wrap it up.
That's right.
Okay, well, I think that that's about all we have time for. But
To be continued.
is there anything else that you want to add? before
Yeah,
this tape?
I'm still alive.
Well, you went into the army. You should talk about that.
Oh, I went in the army, and I did all kinds of different things like
Where
that.
did you go in the army?
Europe, I was drafted in 1955. Everyone was drafted, all men. And I was very fortunate because I didn't have to go to Korea. I had had college deferments. I was in the Naval Reserve after war broke out with Korea. I joined the Naval Reserve in Kansas City while I was visiting my uncle, Richard Whiting, and then transferred. And that was the only way to get out of the military, out of active duty at that time, because I knew I wanted to go to college. Well, then I went inactive, and shortly thereafter, the college deferment system came into being. So I was very fortunate. I got a deferment all through until I got, through my master's degree. And then I went down to the draft board and said, okay, you guys have been great. You've deferred me all these years. Now I'll go. Just
And
take
volunteered to go to Europe.
and take me now. And I volunteered to go to Europe. And by God, while a lot were still going to Korea, even though the war had ended, I was very fortunate. I was sent to Europe, and I had a marvelous 2 years in the military, as it turned out. Just fantastic.
So, did you go to school before? Or
I went to school before. I got a bachelor's degree from Northwestern, and
did
that
you have any academic awards?
yeah, I graduated with distinction, which would be like cum laude, and I was Phi Beta Kappa. And then I got a master's degree in Purdue in industrial psychology, because that was one of the leading schools at the time in that. And I decided not to go for a PhD because I was tired of school and just wanted to go to work, make some money. And along those lines at Purdue, I met Fleur, my bride-to-be. And somehow or other, she survived the 2 years that I was in the Army, and when I